Madam Speaker, I rise today to discuss the latest disturbing revelations relating to President Biden's nominee for U.S. Secretary of Labor, Julie Su. The nomination remains stalled, and for good reason. Ms. Su's record of gross mismanagement, historic, unmatched mismanagement, as California's labor secretary under Governor Gavin Newsom is now well understood. For example, during Ms. Su's tenure, $32.6 billion in taxpayer funds were fraudulently paid to death row inmates, international criminal syndicates, and other fraudsters. This fraud was possible because Su waived fraud prevention protections, actually removed guardrails despite repeated warnings, and she failed to follow the common sense practices of other states, and then failed to take corrective actions as billions were lost to fraud. At the same time that this fraud was occurring, by the way, Su improperly denied or delayed for weeks, months, sometimes indefinitely, legitimate unemployment claims for millions of Americans. Madam Speaker, I've now spoken on this floor several times to make sure that Americans are aware of that track record and understand the risk that elevating Ms. Su poses. It is a reasonable inference that a nominee who failed in her role as state labor secretary would likewise fail in the role as U.S. labor secretary, and certainly has failed to earn such a promotion. Well, now, that is no longer merely an inference. It is the reality, because as her nomination has stalled, Ms. Su has all the while been serving as the acting secretary at the Department of Labor. And unsurprisingly, she has brought her record of mismanagement from California to the Department of Labor as acting secretary, with terrible consequences. A recent report from the New York Times has uncovered evidence of a major spike in unaccompanied migrant minors, children, being funneled to work in dangerous jobs in violation of federal labor law. The article is titled, "As Migrant Children Were Put to Work, U.S. Ignored Warnings." The Times reports the White House and federal agencies were repeatedly alerted to signs of children at risk. The warnings were ignored or missed. To take one example from the Times article, a boy working construction said he felt ashamed about not knowing how to read. He too was released in 2021 at age 12 and was immediately put to work by a man who had sponsored at least 5 children. In another case, at a day labor pickup site, a 13-year-old released last year to a man he had never met said he wished he could enroll in middle school and start learning English. The problem is much broader than a handful of cases. Signs of migrant child labor have been uncovered inside industrial workplaces, including several auto part factories. Additionally, over 100 children were found working the overnight shift, scouring meatpacking plants across the country, according to the Times. Now, I should note, monitoring workplaces to prevent child labor is the job of the Labor Department. Julie Su was Deputy Labor Secretary and is now Acting Labor Secretary. And she held those roles as children were exploited to work in grueling conditions in violation of federal labor law. This pattern of conduct almost exactly mirrors Su's tenure in California. Repeated warnings of a serious problem, little to no preventative action, followed by a refusal to accept responsibility or change course when her failures are brought to light. And unfortunately, this isn't the only major concern that has emerged during Julie Su's short time as acting U.S. Secretary of Labor. At the same time that children have been exploited in workplaces, Ms. Su has failed to properly manage the H-2A program for bringing in temporary agricultural workers on a legal basis. Just this morning, House Education and the Workforce Chairwoman Virginia Foxx and I sent an oversight letter to Acting Secretary Su regarding serious delays in the processing of H-2A applications. In the letter, we write, "It has come to the attention of the Committee on Education and the Workforce that employers applying for labor certifications at the Department of Labor for H-2A agricultural workers are facing substantial delays. These delays can be tremendously harmful for American agriculture. The arrival of workers can be delayed by weeks, causing inefficiencies and supply chain disruptions. The planting and harvesting windows offer only a short amount of time to meet the season's needs. Our understanding is that this worsening problem is caused by unnecessary and avoidable delays at the Department of Labor." Incredibly, a Department of Labor official, Mike Rios, who serves as Regional Agricultural Enforcement Director at the Wage and Hour Division, is quoted as saying this. He said, "You can see that the H-2A program literally is the purchase of human beings, is literally the purchase of humans to perform difficult work under terrible conditions, sometimes including subhuman living conditions." This is a bipartisan program that has been created and has existed for a long time. He says that, but that's what he had to say about it. He's also quoted as saying, "You can throw a rock and hit a violation in the agricultural industry." That is a strange thing for him to say, considering that it is his department and Julie Su's department, the Department of Labor, that is responsible for preventing those sort of violations, for enforcing our labor laws. So under Julie Su's leadership, the Department of Labor is failing to protect workers, including children, is unfairly attacking America's farmers, and is failing to support our agriculture sector's workforce needs under a program authorized by federal law. She has been acting secretary for only a matter of months and was deputy secretary for 2 years. In that time, she has directly transferred her record of mismanagement from California to the rest of the nation. And I should say, in California right now, we have the nation's largest budget deficit. We have the nation's second highest unemployment rate. We have the nation's lowest rate of income growth. We have the highest rate of poverty. This is the direct result of the mismanagement and the anti-worker, anti-business, anti-opportunity policies from the likes of Julie Su and Gavin Newsom. With everything we now know, to elevate Ms. Su would be to take our country down the failed path of California with eyes wide open. I urge President Biden to choose a different course. It is past time to withdraw this nomination. Madam Speaker, I rise today to support the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, which passed the House of Representatives earlier today. This bill fixes a critical loophole and empowers law enforcement to continue to have the tools they need to prevent fentanyl distribution in communities across America. We are seeing staggering amounts of fentanyl pour across the southern border, flooding our communities with illicit and lethal pills, killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. This is now the leading cause of death for young people in our country. More than car accidents, more than suicides, more than anything. It is affecting every community in our country, including my own. During the State of the Union a few months ago, I was honored to have as my guests two of our nation's leading advocates for fentanyl awareness, the parents of a young man named Zach Didier, who tragically lost his life to fentanyl. He was a senior at Whitney High School, a standout student with no history of drug use, and from one pill, he tragically lost his life. His parents had to go through the gut-wrenching experience of seeing him get letters in the mail, accepting him to some of our nation's leading universities after he had passed away. There is simply no doubt that addressing the fentanyl crisis will save the lives of many of my constituents and of people in every community in our country. And this act, the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, is a major step in that direction. In fact, the act itself is common sense. Fentanyl is currently classified as a Schedule I drug, which gives the Drug Enforcement Agency the power to enforce and arrest criminals involved in producing and distributing fentanyl. To avoid prosecution, criminals have begun to manufacture drugs nearly chemically identical to fentanyl. Now, these drugs are just as deadly. They mimic fentanyl in every way, but they don't fall under the technical definition of fentanyl. In response, the Department of Justice and DEA temporarily classified these fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs. This common sense act makes this temporary classification permanent rather than letting it expire. Giving law enforcement the tools they need to prosecute those responsible and involved in the fentanyl crisis, from producers to dealers, is a critical component of the multi-pronged approach needed to save lives and stop fentanyl from destroying our communities. And we know this approach works. After the DEA classified fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs, law enforcement encounters of these fentanyl copycat drugs fell by over 90%. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to support a proven measure that will save lives and to vote aye on the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, which just passed the House today with bipartisan support and has the support of President Biden as well.